Hello, I'm Mike and welcome to my DIY workshop. In your DIY work you will from time to time probably come across the problem of needing to cut something made of metal. So for that you need the tool for the job, which is a hacksaw. Or if it's sheet metal you may be able to use metal shears like this. You can't avoid using the proper tool for the job, but if it's a small piece of sheet metal I can show you an improvised way of cutting effectively without needing these. But before you start cutting you need to figure out how you're going to grip the item to be cut, because some of them are awkward shapes. So in this video I can show you various ways of improvising an effective grip to enable you to cut those items safely. First of all, you could be needing to fit a door threshold strip to go down and protect the edge of the carpet in a doorway. You have to cut this to length and almost certainly notch out the ends to fit round the door frame. Then for windows you might be fitting a curtain pole, which is a metal tube like that, or a tubular chrome wardrobe hanging rail or towel rail for the bathroom. And also, if you need to fit a window roller blind and cut down the width to suit the window opening, you will have to cut down the metal tubular core in the centre of the blind. Now we've got threaded bolts like that you may need to cut down in length, and an alternative screw. And where you've got a fixing screw for a doorknob, these screws are very often supplied too long and you have to cut them down in length to suit the thickness of the door. Out of your junk box you might have a very useful bracket like this, but you'd like to cut it down so that that leg is the same length as that one. Here there's a piece of very robust strapping which might be ideal for a little job you're doing, but you'd like to cut that ragged end off to tidy it up. Then we come to sheet metal, where you might want to cut a special shape to do a particular job, perhaps covering a hole under the carpet in the floorboards. And the list goes on. As mentioned before, the hacksaw is the tool we use mostly for cutting metal. A typical hacksaw has a rigid frame. It has a screw device here to pull the blade taut. The blade is removable. The blades have holes at each end which hook on these things here. And the reason it has to be pulled taut because we cut on the push stroke, so when you replace the blade you have to make sure that the teeth point that way. I would recommend a general purpose blade which has about 18 teeth per inch, TPI. On the junior hacksaw, similar sort of thing, rigid frame, tightening device there, but in this case the blade is narrower that way and the teeth are much finer, which is good for fine work and where you're having difficulty holding the item that you're trying to cut. When you want to start making your hacksaw cut, remember that the blade should be fitted to the frame so that the teeth point that way so that you can cut on the forward stroke. It means, however, that the teeth pointing that way will easily catch on the edge of your piece of metal and stop you from making a smooth push forward. So make sure that your saw blade is at a very small angle to the piece you're trying to cut, and then you'll find it's very easy to push the saw and get it going. Similarly, when you're cutting a tube, you start cutting there, but once you've started cutting into the tube, effectively the blade gets down to there and you're trying to cut the tube in two places at once, and you'll have a job because the teeth will keep catching on the edge of the metal. And that is why in the next demonstration I repeatedly say turn the tube so that the saw goes backwards like this. then you won't have that problem of trying to cut the tube in two places. Let's have a go at cutting this piece of chromium plated tube, which could be a towel rail or a wardrobe hanging rail, or with a different finish it could be a window curtain pole. So we need something to stop that moving while we try to cut it. So if you've got a bench vise like this, you can put a piece of wood in it, arrange it so that the wood is sticking up, and we can put the tube against it, and if you line up where you want to cut exactly with the end of that piece of wood, you can use the piece of wood as a shoulder in order to start the cut. If you haven't got a bench vise, you might have, or you might be able to make something like this. It's commonly called a bench hook because it's used like that to saw wood, but in this case it's ideal to put the tube on, to cut the tube. So normally it would be used like that on the bench, but I'm going to turn it round for the camera and do it this way so that you can see what I'm doing. So again, there's the line of cut lined up with that piece of wood there, and it's ideal to get my cut started. What I also like to do is to use a piece of rubber, which is actually an old bicycle inner tube, and that keeps the tube gripped much firmer, because being smooth chrome, the tube can rotate. Now I've cut through the wall of the tube just there, and so I'm starting to cut in two places. So if I rotate the tube like that, so that I'm only cutting at that point, it'll be much easier. The other advantage, and it's essential really, of doing this, rotate it forward like that, is that I constantly check my cutting line. If you try and keep the tube in one place and just cut all the way through, you'll very likely go offline one way or the other. This way, by rotating it, you can constantly check your line against the edge of the tape and end up with a nice, neat cut. So here's the finished result. We've managed to cut it nice and square across the tube, but we've got some sharp bits of metal sticking out. So the thing to do is to rotate the tube while you're filing. Now I know I've just been demonstrating with the benefit of a workbench and a vise. You may not have a workbench or a vise, or you may be working away from your workshop, in which case you'll almost certainly be on your hands and knees on the floor managing. This bench hook is ideal on the floor if you have a dust sheet underneath to catch the metal particles, and then you can go ahead and saw like that on the floor. If it skids about a little bit, see if you can find a doormat or something to rest on, and that will hold it in place. I'm pleased to say that there's a very neat way of cutting metal tube without using a hacksaw. To do that, we use a plumber's pipe cutter, which has a very sharp-edged wheel here, which is forced to dig into the side of the tube. Other advantages are that we only need a single mark where we need to cut. We don't need to mark all the way around. We're not using a saw, so there are no metal particles dropping on the floor, and the whole thing's very quick and neat. So let's set ourselves up to do the cut. So I've got it set up so that the cutting wheel is dead on the mark that I put, and what we do is tighten this black knob a little bit, rotate the whole thing around the tube, tighten up this again, rotate, and go on like that. And as you can see here, the cutting wheel is really putting an indentation there where it's actually cutting. In a minute we'll hear a click and it'll be all over. There we are, so that's a very neat finish. Something you need to avoid as much as possible when cutting metal is this movement and shuddering. If you try to saw that piece of metal there, as you can see, it's shuddering, and most of my energy in moving the saw blade is lost in the movement and shuddering. I'm not getting an effective cut at all. So you need to make sure that when you're cutting as near as possible to the surface that is supporting the metal. Now you can hear and you can see that I'm cutting really quite efficiently. Let's suppose then we've got this bracket from the junk box and we want to cut a piece off to make that distance the same as that. I've marked my line on there and we can anchor it in the vise like that, so it's pretty firm. And I can saw. There's an alternative way of holding the bracket firm while you saw. I've clamped it onto this little step stool with a small clamp. I realise it only works if you've got a clamp. I'm sawing downwards because the stool gives me more support for the bracket compared with if I try and saw that way. And now another idea. The bracket already had holes in, so I've used the holes to screw it to this piece of scrap wood, and now I've got an excellent way of holding it in position, and off I go. Again, sawing downwards so that the stool is helping to support the bracket. And now I'm going to show you how to cut a threaded bolt. That's the bit I want to cut off. So we must always put a nut on first because the cutting process disturbs the thread and sometimes it's very hard to get a nut to start on the freshly cut bolt. So because that's going to be scrap, that bit there, I can afford to put it in my vise and it doesn't matter if it damages the thread. This is an engineer's vise mounted on a block of wood which itself is set into my joiner's vise. So I can take all of this away and do something else and bring it back when I like. So once you've got a nice steady sawing action going, put your other hand on the hacksaw because this will help with the push as well as guiding the saw and keeping it straight. So we threaded the nut on, if you remember, so that when we take it off it'll clean up the thread where we've cut. That's where I started cutting, but I'm going to pretend that this is the cut end. And first of all, before taking the nut off, file it like this and file upwards, not downwards. File upwards and that will smooth off any funny bits of thread hanging around, and then your nut should come right off and you're good to go. Here's an easy to make gripping device for awkward items like a threaded bolt. It's a couple of pieces of wood, 2 screws, and that is really holding that bolt very tight so that you can saw it. Now I've taken this apart for a moment, but I hope you noticed that the bolt was all the way across because I've got plenty of length on the bolt. However, if you've got shorter screws like this, I've put an extra large hole there. That's not to take a screw, it's just to accommodate the head of the screw when we put the clamping device together like that. And likewise for the shorter screw for the knob. And that enables the device to be clamped up with the screws and it's gripping all of the thread without damaging it. So here it is in action, resting on some kind of firm surface. In a similar sort of way, I've inserted that bracket that we were cutting earlier on. Always try and use a nice steady sawing action. Here we are again, but this time I've taken that screw out and put it down here because I'm now gripping this piece of sheet metal which I want to cut down there. And now we come to using metal shears. This is only a small pair of shears and they're straight bladed, which means that they're not suitable for doing long cuts. You need to get a more sophisticated type of metal shear to cut long lengths. The other thing is, these are only suitable for very thin sheet metal. This is only about 1/2 millimetre thick, whereas this piece here is 2 millimetres thick and the shears won't even look at that. So I've got my protective leather gloves on because we're handling metal with nice sharp edges. I've got a line there which I'm going to cut along, and we start off quite straightforwardly. Got to keep my eye on the cutting line, so it's easy to go off the line. Now we get to about this position with the shears, and the metal needs to come up that way and this piece needs to go down to get past the jaws of the shears. As you can see, it's not straightforward. So I'll just show you a better method, but this does depend on you having a workshop vise. So here's my vise, and what I've also done is mounted the shears in the jaws of the vise, held very tight. And now it'd be much easier for me to control the shears. The problem now is I'm hitting the side of the vise, so I'll have to turn the sheet round to cut from the other angle. So that's a quick demonstration of cutting sheet metal. As you can see, it's not easy, but it might just get you out of trouble if you need to just cut short lengths, and you have got some of these, or you can borrow some. Now I'm going to show you an improvised way of cutting a short piece of sheet metal without using the shears. This method does depend on you having access to an engineer's vise like that with metal jaws. There's my piece of metal. I want to cut it down that line, and I haven't got any of those. So what do? I use a hammer and chisel in the following fashion. First of all, put the metal in the vise with my cutting line just visible. Now you can use a tiny cold chisel like that, but a wider one is better, and this one's even better still. So what we do, instead of hitting directly, we hit at an angle. So this is at an angle, so I'm approaching that way. So gentle taps through the hammer, and I'm pressing down the chisel, and I'm pointing down as well. Now, I've used up the width of my vise, so I need to move the metal along. And we can finish it off. Again, a slight angle. Doesn't need much effort with the hammer. So it's a fairly straight but dangerous edge at the moment. So what we need to do then is to use a file to smooth it. So you need to work on that in order to get rid of the roughness and to make it safe. But that shows you the idea. So there you are then. I hope that's given you some new ideas on cutting awkward metal items. If you'd like to subscribe to my channel, you can click on the circular avatar appearing on the left now. Otherwise, you can watch some of my other videos by clicking icons on the right of the screen. Thank you very much for watching.